Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know, but like, yeah.
Gather round, fine friends, gather round, huddle close like penguins, so my voice is not lost on the wind.
Guys, come on here, doing a head count.
Is Kobe doing it? Thank you, Kobe, for minding the group. Very appreciated. So, my friends, behind us there is a monument. Now, this monument is very interesting, if you ask me. It's a Celtic cross. It's not one of the old ones. It was built in the 1800s, 1862 to be precise. And it's got some interesting things. There's stag's antlers, very symbolic of Scotland and the Highlands. But below it, it's an elephant, isn't it? Now that is, for me, very bizarre. Why would an elephant appear on a cross that's Celtic? It makes no real sense. If the keen-eyed of you have looked over there, I will beat you to it and say this is called the India Cross. This is a cross which was erected in 1862. This is 4 years after the end of what is now known as the Indian Uprising, but more popularly known as the Indian Mutiny, one of the largest mass acts of rebellion in India that took place or the largest act of mass rebellion that took place in India in the 19th century. I will go into the context of the story first, but just this monument seems benign, it seems harmless, it doesn't seem to speak to any sort of history of oppression or suppression. It simply says, it's sacred to the memory of the officers of the non-commissioned, the officers and non-commissioned officers and private soldiers of the Roman numerals Highland Regiment. It's the 82nd. The 82nd, I was trying to work it out. Highland Regiment, who fell in the suppression of the mutiny of the Native Army of India in 1857 and 1858. The memorial is erected as a tribute of respect for their surviving brothers and officials, their comrades and many other officers who formerly belonged to the regiment. 1862. Seems like a very standard war memorial. But this made me think about war memorials in general. So of course, we had a role in the suppression of India. We had a role in the cultural empiricism with figures like Duff. Physically, Scots frequently served as soldiers. Here we have evidence of that right here, next to the castle. You cannot say that this is something that is not flush. This is not something where Scotland was not involved. Next to one of our probably the most famous monument in Edinburgh, or not monument, landmark in Edinburgh, there is this monument. Now, the Indian Mutiny, as it's referred to here, or uprising as I very much prefer to call it, as do many today, started in 1857. The beginning of the story is that many Indians have been conscripted into service with the East India Trading Company. Now, post the arrival of Alexander Duff and the aggressive nature of the East India Trading Company, the Indian economy was suffering. People were starving, and of course it was not the colonial people who were struggling at all. It was the natives. They also were being subjected to a series of religious intolerances. The final straw was an explosive one. It was the Enfield rifle. Now, the Enfield rifle was a new issue rifle for the sepoys, as they were called, the Indians serving in the army. Now, it was rumoured that these rifles were greased with pig fat, which incensed both Hindus and Muslims alike due to the sacred natures of pig and cow fat, due to the sacred natures of those respective animals. Within moments, a mutiny had broken out. Within days, it had spread across different parts of the north of India. Within weeks, the entirety of the north of India was in open rebellion. It was vast. It is written into the history books as a mutiny. A mutiny is something that I think of on pirate ships, not something that occurs across entire plains. This is why the word uprising, I personally believe, and many historians and lots of community-based activists also believe, is a far more correct term. You also have people who call it just a rebellion straight up. It's very much open to debate, but what for me it is not is a mutiny. The mutiny encompassed hundreds of thousands of people from all different backgrounds across India serving for different reasons, trying to find freedom in different ways. It was a very complicated movement, but it was so vast it took a year for the most powerful nation in the world to suppress it. 1858, it was finally suppressed and brought to an end. And of course, many Brits died fighting to try and suppress the Indians. We may feel sorry, of course, it's never nice to die at war, and these people may have not chosen to have been here, but they were very much there. And indeed, the consequences for those Indians who did rebel, who did stand up to the oppression of the British Empire, was brutal. Mass shootings took place, mass murders took place, mass starvation took place, and most horribly was the strapping to cannons of ringleaders. Crowds were forcibly gathered, and ringleaders or supposed ringleaders of the mutiny, this is without trial of course, were strapped to cannons and blown to pieces in front of these crowds. This was a genuine use of violence, and this is a monument that, as much as it is not erected to stand as a testimony to what happened in those years, it in some ways does. There is no mention of the many hundreds of thousands of Indians who were involved, of the tens of thousands of Indians who lost their lives. There is no mention of that. There is no monument stood next to it. There is nothing like that in Edinburgh or in Britain. So I think this monument and many other monuments throughout Britain, in fact, very much allude to this. They are more complicated than they look. For instance, I didn't have a chance to stop at it, but down the road on Princes Street, there is the Wellington Monument before it becomes Waterloo Place. Wellington, of course, very famous for the Battle of Waterloo, where he vanquished Napoleon wonderfully in a good British and French duel. He cut his teeth fighting in Maratha wars, and he was incredibly brutal to the point that the East India Trading Company had to rein him in. They thought he was too much. And yet, there he is, he has his statue. History is very complicated, I appreciate that, but to just talk about one element that doesn't explore this very difficult and complex nature, for me, is not enough. And if you want this to tie into, so again, we are very much in India at the moment, of course. Look at it, it looks like India, it feels like India. If you want this to tie into the West Indies over there in the new town, the violence used to, in response to the Indian Uprising of 1857 and 1858, was used a few years later as justification for the exceptional violence used to suppress the Jamaican rebellion. The governor at the time said if it wasn't for the violence used in the mutiny, they would have come back, and so I've done the exact same thing. So the two were very much linked. They were not existing in polarised universes. And at the heart, once again, we find Scottish people from all backgrounds in all places. So I have just 2 more stops to go to. We're going to wander down to David Hume, and then we'll make our way over to the National Museum. That was the most depressing, well, one of the most depressing moments of the tour.